The late summer air in St. Mary Mead was mellow, filled with the scents of roses and freshly cut grass. The small village, with its tidy hedgerows and neat cottages, slumbered in a kind of timeless charm that belied the fact that beneath its surface lay an undercurrent of watchful eyes and whispered gossip. Few people understood this better than Miss Jane Marple, who, while sitting on her sunny garden bench with her knitting in hand, saw rather more than most. This particular week, however, brought something unusual. Talk in the village wasn't of the vicar's new sermon or Mrs. Price Ridley's latest complaint about the state of the post office queue. No, the matter that occupied every tongue was the invitation extended by Lady Caroline Hartwell of Hartwell Manor. She had announced through carefully embossed cards, delivered by hand, that she would be hosting a small but select afternoon tea at the Pitt Manor House to display her collection of newly acquired painted teacups. Lady Caroline, a widow of some standing, had returned from the continent with an air of mystery and a crate of fragile porcelain. The tea set, she declared, was unique, decorated by a little-known but brilliant artisan, each cup painted with tiny, intricate scenes of English gardens. She intended to make a spectacle of them, and, knowing the eagerness of villagers for novelty, she was not wrong in assuming that every invitee would accept. Miss Marple, though not generally drawn to collections, received her invitation with a faint smile. She had known Lady Caroline for years, though they were hardly intimates. Caroline had a sharp tongue and a regal presence that unsettled many, but she was undeniably fascinating. Miss Marple felt a quiet tug of curiosity. After all, one could learn a great deal at a tea table, especially one surrounded by egos, ambitions, and hidden rivalries. The guests, when the afternoon arrived, Miss Marple set aside her knitting, donned her pale blue summer frock with a sensible straw hat, and made her way up the gravel path to Hartwell Manor. The manor itself was an elegant Georgian house, ivy climbing its mellow stone walls with an air of faded grandeur. The guests had already begun to assemble in the drawing-room, where sunlight streamed through tall windows onto polished floors. A long table, draped in lace, stood near the hearth, displaying the famed painted teacups like treasures in a museum. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, surveyed the gathering. Lady Caroline Hartwell, the hostess, resplendent in violet silk, her pearl necklace gleaming against her pale skin, a woman accustomed to command. Colonel Arthur Redmayne, retired army officer, with a booming voice and a handlebar mustache, known to bore company with endless tales of the Rog. Mrs. Beatrice Redmayne, the colonel's much younger second wife, graceful and charming, with a streak of mischief in her eye. Mr. Edmund Blake, Lady Caroline's nephew, a restless young man in his 30s, recently returned from London after business troubles. Miss Harriet Fielding, Lady Caroline's companion, plain, dutiful, and perpetually watchful, always hovering near her mistress. Reverend Julian Miles, the village vicar, kindly but occasionally pompous, with a keen interest in antiquities and church silver. Miss Marple quietly slipped into a chair near the window, unnoticed by most, and listened. The atmosphere, the conversation flowed with the usual pleasantries, remarks on the fine weather, the roses blooming especially well this year, and Lady Caroline's successful travels abroad. But beneath it, Miss Marple detected small tensions. Colonel Redmayne, for instance, laughed too loudly at his wife's light teasing, though his eyes narrowed as if jealous of her charm. Edmund Blake shifted restlessly, pouring himself more sherry than was necessary for a summer afternoon. Harriet Fielding flinched whenever Lady Caroline addressed her sharply. The vicar, meanwhile, hovered by the table of teacups, extolling their craftsmanship as if he were an expert. Though his knowledge was shaky, Lady Caroline soon called the company's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying with crisp authority, "I present to you the pride of Hartwell Manor, my painted teacups. Each one is entirely unique. Notice the delicate brushwork, the roses, the ivy, the little English gardens. Exquisite, are they not?" Polite admiration followed, though Miss Marple noted that not all admiration was genuine. Mrs. Redmayne's smile was polite, but faintly mocking. Edmund Blake gazed at the cups with something closer to calculation than appreciation. Harriet Fielding, poor woman, looked nervous even in admiration, as though she feared her mistress might snap at her for clumsy words. The tea was served. Lady Caroline herself poured, with almost ceremonial care, choosing a cup for each guest from the collection. "One must experience them properly," she insisted. Porcelain is meant to be used, not merely admired. Miss Marple received a delicate cup painted with a garden of foxgloves and daisies. She sipped politely, observing the others. Mrs. Redmayne's cup bore tulips. The Colonel's had a spray of roses. Edmund's showed lavender fields, and so on. There was laughter, talk, the chink of spoons on china. Miss Marple knitted together the threads of conversation in her mind. She caught Edmund making a barbed remark about inheritance, which Lady Caroline dismissed with a frosty smile. The Colonel boasted of military campaigns, to which the vicar listened with exaggerated interest. Mrs. Redmayne let slip a comment about not all treasures being honestly come by, which earned her a sharp glance from Caroline. Harriet tried to hush it with nervous laughter, but her mistress silenced her with a glare. It was, in short, a perfectly ordinary village, except that ordinary teas did not usually end in death. The incidenta's plates of scones and cucumber sandwiches were passed. Lady Caroline lifted her cup once more. She made a toast, of sorts, to beauty, to tradition, and to the refinement of English taste, and sipped. Within moments, her expression changed. A strange look crossed her face, surprise, then pain. She gasped, her hand trembling, the delicate cup slipping from her grasp and shattering on the parquet floor. The room froze. Caroline swayed, clutched at Harriet's arm, and collapsed heavily onto the carpet. "Good heavens!" cried the vicar. "Fetch the doctor!" bellowed the Colonel. Mrs. Redmayne screamed. Harriet knelt beside her mistress, wringing her hands. Edmund stood rigid, pale, his glass of sherry forgotten. Miss Marple, her knitting forgotten, rose swiftly but calmly. She saw the signs clearly: the sudden convulsion, the bluish tinge at the lips, the faint bitter odor rising from the spilled tea. She had lived long enough, and observed carefully enough, to recognize the signs of poison. Badly Caroline Hartwell was dead. The aftermath in the shocked minutes that followed. There was a confusion of voices, running footsteps, and the clatter of the butler rushing for the doctor. But even before the arrival of medical assistance, Miss Marple knew no doctor could revive Lady Caroline. The painted teacups stood gleaming on the table, innocent in their prettiness. Yet one of them, perhaps more than one, had carried death. Miss Marple's mind, quiet and precise, began to turn. She glanced round the room, noting faces, gestures, words unsaid. Suspicion lingered like a shadow among the guests. The Colonel's moustache twitched as he muttered about damned foreigners and their tricks. Mrs. Redmayne, pale but oddly composed now, sipped her water with steady hands. Edmund Blake rubbed his forehead, as though calculating rather than grieving. Harriet Fielding wept quietly, yet there was fear in her eyes beyond mere sorrow. The vicar wrung his hands, exclaiming platitudes about God's will, and Miss Marple, adjusting her spectacles, thought silently, "One of you has just committed murder, and it shall not be long before I find out who." The village doctor, Dr. Leonard Sims, arrived at Hartwell Manor within 20 minutes, his black bag swinging and his brow furrowed. He bent over Lady Caroline's lifeless form, examined her briefly, and straightened with a grave look. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," he announced. "Lady Hartwell is gone. The symptoms are well suspicious. I must inform the authorities." This pronouncement was met with a murmur of dismay. Colonel Redmayne barked something about over-hasty conclusions, while Mrs. Redmayne sighed dramatically into a lace handkerchief. Edmund Blake paced the room like a caged animal. Harriet Fielding dabbed at her eyes, whispering, "Oh, madam," over and over. Reverend Miles began a solemn prayer. Miss Marple, seated again in her chair with her hands folded, said nothing, but her eyes never left the painted teacups still gleaming on the lace-covered table. Inspector Graves arrives by evening. Inspector Harold Graves of the County Constabulary had arrived, a square-shouldered man with thinning hair and a no-nonsense manner. He asked the guests to remain until statements were taken. "It seems clear," he said, surveying the cups, "that Lady Hartwell's tea was poisoned. Until we know more, I must consider this a case of foul play." A collective gasp followed. "Murder," Mrs. Redmayne whispered, her voice tinged with theatrical tremor. "Good heavens," the vicar muttered, clutching his Bible. "Rubbish," Colonel Redmayne thundered. Caroline was a hearty woman, likely a seizure, that's all. People jumped to conclusions these days, but his words lacked conviction. Miss Marple, in her quiet, bird-like voice, interjected, "I do believe the inspector is correct. Lady Caroline's collapse was too sudden, too deliberate. I could not help noticing the faint odor from her teacup. Bitter almonds. Inspector, quitte, unmistakable. The room fell silent. Inspector Graves turned to her with mild surprise. And you are Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead, she said gently. I am no expert, of course, but one does observe things, living as long as I have. Bitter almonds, as you know, are the unmistakable scent of cyanide. Graves gave her a long, measuring look, then nodded curtly. Very well, Miss Marple, I shall bear your observation in mind. The inspector began his inquiries, and Miss Marple, seemingly unobtrusive, listened with care. Colonel Redmayne insisted that Lady Caroline had been as strong as an ox and claimed ignorance of poison. He was loud, defensive, and kept repeating that such matters were best left to men of action. Miss Marple noticed how his eyes darted whenever his wife spoke. Mrs. Beatrice Redmayne, graceful in her sorrow, spoke of her dear friend Caroline with soft tones, yet her words were tinged with subtle mockery. She admitted to knowing a little about herb lore, which made Inspector Graves' eyebrows rise. Miss Marple noted that Beatrice's hands were perfectly steady as she poured herself another glass of water. Edmund Blake, pale and restless, confessed that he and his aunt had argued earlier in the week about money. She was threatening to cut me off, he said bitterly. But murder? No, never. Still, he could not meet anyone's eye. Harriet Fielding, trembling, claimed devotion to Lady Caroline. She was kind, in her way, she murmured. Yet Miss Marple detected something unsaid in her words, a resentment long suppressed. Reverend Miles spoke piously of God's will, but his gaze lingered on the teacups with unusual intensity. He mentioned, almost eagerly, that he had once studied poisons of antiquity in connection with church history. A curious remark, thought Miss Marple. Miss Marple's first observations later that evening. After statements were given, Inspector Graves permitted the guests to retire to their rooms at Hartwell Manor. The storm of scandal meant none were permitted to leave just yet. Miss Marple, ever courteous, asked permission to remain in the drawing-room. She settled herself near the teacups, knitting quietly while her mind worked. She thought of the cups themselves, each different, each beautiful, each used by a different guest. The poison must have been in Lady Caroline's cup specifically. That suggested planning, but had it been introduced before the gathering or slipped in at the table? She recalled the moment Lady Caroline had poured. Yes, she had chosen each cup for each guest, almost ceremoniously. That meant the killer could not know in advance which cup would fall to which person, unless the poison had been introduced after the cups were filled. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She distinctly remembered Harriet Fielding hovering with the sugar bowl, and Edmund Blake had poured sherry rather liberally. Mrs. Redmayne had leaned across the table at one point to adjust a plate of sandwiches. So many small opportunities. She thought again of Lady Caroline herself, a formidable woman, wealthy, the sort who accumulated both admirers and enemies. Miss Marple knew well enough, it is not always the obvious quarrel that leads to murder. Sometimes it is the small, smouldering resentment, carefully hidden, that ignites quiet conversations over the next 2 days. The guests remained confined at the manor while inquiries continued. Miss Marple, with her unassuming presence, found occasion to converse quietly with each. She sat with Mrs. Redmayne in the rose garden. Such a dreadful business. Miss Marple sighed. Mrs. Redmayne gave a delicate shrug. Caroline was never an easy woman. She liked her control. I dare say some would call her tyrannical. She laughed lightly, then added, not that I begrudge her, but there are those who might. Miss Marple knitted a few rows, then remarked, it is curious, is it not, how often poisons appear in the tales of women. Gentle hands, yet deadly knowledge. Mrs. Redmayne's eyes flickered, but she said smoothly, indeed, though I assure you my hands are more suited to arranging flowers than mixing potions. Later, Miss Marple found Harriet Fielding in the morning-room, dusting fretfully. You must miss her dreadfully, Miss Marple said kindly. Harriet bit her lip. Yes, of course, she depended on me. I owed her everything. But her voice trembled, though she stopped, then whispered, she could be cruel, Miss Marple. Sometimes I thought, but no, it's wicked even to think it. And with that, Harriet burst into tears. From Edmund Blake, Miss Marple learned little. He was restless, chain-smoking, muttering about the injustice of it all. When Miss Marple mentioned his aunt's collection, he snapped. She cared more for those damned cups than for me. Then coloured, realizing he had said too much. The vicar, however, intrigued her most. Over tea in the study, he expounded at length about the history of ceremonial poisonings in ancient cultures. "Fascinating, is it not?" he said, with unsettling enthusiasm, "how a chalice or cup becomes the very instrument of fate." Miss Marple smiled gently but filed away the remark. A curious discovery on the third morning. Miss Marple rose early and wandered through the manor gardens. Near the back gate, she noticed a scrap of paper lodged beneath a rosebush. Picking it up delicately, she saw it was torn from a notebook, smeared with what looked like ink. On it were scrawled hurried words, "Ensure it is her cup. No mistakes." Miss Marple's heart gave a quiet flutter. The handwriting was untidy, unfamiliar, but the implication was unmistakable. Deliberate intent. She tucked the paper into her knitting bag and returned indoors, her mind alive with possibilities. That evening, Inspector Graves gathered the household again. He reported that the chemist had confirmed cyanide in Lady Caroline's cup. The death was officially declared murder. A murmur rippled through the group. Colonel Redmayne swore under his breath. Beatrice pressed a hand to her lips. Harriet looked faint. Edmund clenched his fists. The vicar murmured a prayer. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, thought, "Yes, murder indeed. But which of you has gone so far as to paint death upon porcelain?" She glanced at the painted teacups gleaming in the lamplight. Harmless objects, yet now each one seemed to whisper secrets. The puzzle had begun to take shape in her mind. Motives, resentments, opportunities, all tangled threads. But Miss Marple had untangled many a skein before, and quietly, with the patience of age and the sharpness of observation, she prepared to unravel this one. The days following Lady Caroline's death fell over Hartwell Manor like a heavy velvet curtain. The grand rooms seemed darker, the air heavier. Even the village beyond whispered more cautiously, as though gossip itself were under suspicion. Inspector Graves remained at the manor, interviewing again and again, but the matter grew no clearer to him. He was a methodical man, preferring evidence that could be weighed and measured. Yet here, evidence slipped through his fingers like sand. Miss Marple, however, never relied on evidence alone. She watched, she listened, and most of all, she compared, always comparing what she saw to the countless human patterns she had observed in St. Mary Mead. People, after all, were much the same everywhere. On the second evening, Miss Marple quietly showed Inspector Graves the scrap of paper she had found in the garden. He frowned. "Ensure it is her cup. No mistakes. Where did you find this?" "In the rose garden, beneath the back gate," Miss Marple said mildly. "And why, Miss Marple, did you not hand it over sooner?" "I find," she replied serenely, "that sometimes a clue, if too hastily revealed, is spoiled. I thought it wiser to see if anyone mentioned a lost note. No one has." Graves rubbed his chin. Could be genuine, could be a plant, but the handwriting devilishly hard to match. Miss Marple only smiled. Yes, she thought, hard to match, if one is not looking in the right direction. The Colonel's outburst the next morning. During breakfast, an altercation broke out. Colonel Redmayne, red-faced, ACCUSE Edmund Blake, of having the most to gain. "You've been living off your aunt's purse strings for years," the Colonel thundered. "Now she's gone, and you'll be master of Hartwell." Edmund slammed his cup down. "I'll thank you not to imply such things. You've more reason than I. Colonel Caroline never could abide you." The Colonel half rose, mustache bristling. "Say that again, boy." Miss Marple intervened gently, her voice as soft as cotton. "Gentlemen, surely anger will not serve us. Lady Caroline would not approve of raised voices at her breakfast table." The two men subsided, muttering, but Miss Marple noted carefully. Edmund's fear was real, the Colonel's bluster equally so. Red herrings perhaps, but herrings all the same must be examined. Harriet's confession later that day. Miss Marple found Harriet Fielding in the still-room, polishing silver with unnecessary vigor. "You seem troubled." "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly. Harriet's eyes filled with tears. "I can't bear it, Miss Marple. Everyone suspects, and I must confess something." "Yes," Miss Marple encouraged, her needles idle in her lap. "It was I who prepared the tea tray. I placed the cups upon it, arranged the spoons. If poison was there, it might have been my doing, though God knows I would never." She broke off, sobbing. Miss Marple touched her hand. "My dear, setting a tray is not the same as poisoning a cup. And if you had truly wished your mistress ill, I dare say you would have chosen a simpler way. Domestic servants always know the simplest." Harriet's sobs quieted. "She was cruel, yes, but she was also my livelihood. Without her, I have nothing. Surely you see that." Miss Marple did see. She also saw that Harriet, while resentful, had neither the calm precision nor the daring required for so deliberate a murder. The Reverend's sermon Sunday brought no respite. The Reverend Miles insisted on holding a brief service in the manor chapel for the household. His sermon was fiery, laced with warnings of divine justice. Poison, he declared from the pulpit, is the weapon of the serpent, sly and unseen. But remember, no secret shall remain hidden from the Almighty. Miss Marple, sitting in a front pew, observed his hands gripping the lectern too tightly, his eyes shining with zeal. His words rang true, but his eagerness disturbed her. Clergymen, she knew, often masked private failings with public righteousness. After the service, she remarked to Inspector Graves, "Did you notice how the Reverend spoke of poison as if he knew it intimately?" Graves grunted. "He's a scholar of oddities, that one. Still, words aren't proof." But Miss Marple knew that words often revealed more than proof. A misleading discovery that afternoon. A maid searching Lady Caroline's writing desk discovered a small vial wrapped in linen. When Inspector Graves unwrapped it, a bitter almond scent filled the air. "Cyanide," he pronounced grimly, "kept in her own desk. Could she have taken it herself?" The suggestion shocked everyone. A suicide. But why would Lady Caroline, proud and imperious, choose such a theatrical end in the presence of her guests? Mrs. Redmayne leaned close to Miss Marple and whispered, "How convenient, don't you think? Perhaps she wished to end her life, but leave us all with scandal." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, dear, Lady Caroline was many things, but self-destructive was not one of them. She enjoyed her control too much. This vial is no more than a distraction." Indeed, Miss Marple thought, the vial's discovery seemed too obvious, too neat, almost as though someone had placed it there deliberately. A red herring, and a clumsy one at that. A secret correspondence on the fourth evening. As the household gathered in subdued silence, Edmund Blake slipped out into the garden. Miss Marple, feigning drowsiness, followed at a discreet distance. She found him beneath the yew hedge, lighting a cigarette and unfolding a letter. He read it by the glow of his match, then tore it into pieces and scattered them among the leaves. When he left, Miss Marple bent and gathered the scraps. Later, in her room, she pieced them together like a puzzle. The letter was from a solicitor in London. "Unless Lady Caroline provides the promised funds, your debtors will proceed with action. Your circumstances are most precarious." Miss Marple sighed softly. Edmund's motive was now plain: financial desperation. Yet motives, she knew, were like flowers many bloomed, but not all bore fruit. But Mrs. Redmayne's alibi the next morning. Mrs. Beatrice Redmayne announced suddenly that she had been in the conservatory when the tea was poured, speaking with the gardener about orchids. Inspector Graves pounced on this. "Are you saying you weren't even in the room?" "Precisely," she said smoothly. "So how could I have tampered with the tea?" But Miss Marple, who recalled distinctly Mrs. Redmayne leaning across the table to adjust the sandwiches, said nothing. She merely smiled. People often lied when truth would have served them better. That, too, was a human pattern. Miss Marple's reflection that evening. Alone in her room, Miss Marple laid out the threads in her mind. Colonel Redmayne, loud, jealous, but too obvious. Beatrice Redmayne, clever, mocking, evasive. Edmund Blake, desperate for money, concealing letters. Harriet Fielding, downtrodden, fearful, yet loyal. Reverend Miles, oddly fascinated by poisons. And then, the painted teacups themselves. Each cup had been filled and handed out by Lady Caroline. The poison must have been introduced afterwards. But how? Sugar, milk, a drop slipped in during distraction. Miss Marple closed her eyes. She saw again the moment Lady Caroline raised her cup. The sunlight glinting on porcelain, the faint scent, the broken fragments on the parquet. She smiled faintly. The pieces were not yet all in place, but she had the curious sense, like a knitter who sees her pattern emerging, that the design was there, waiting to be revealed. That household was restless, tempers fraying. Inspector Graves muttered of arrests, yet Miss Marple knew the truth was still concealed beneath red herrings, the planted vial, the false alibi, the arguments staged to mislead. And as she sat by the fire with her knitting, she thought, it is not only the teacups that were painted. The whole scene has been painted, like a picture, to deceive. But soon, very soon, the cracks in the paint will show. The days passed with heavy unease. Hartwell Manor, once a symbol of Lady Caroline's authority, now seemed hollow, like a stage where actors waited nervously for the curtain to fall. Meals were subdued, glances furtive, conversation brittle. Miss Marple alone appeared at ease, though her needles clicked faster than usual. She had begun to see the tapestry forming, not yet complete, but its outline unmistakable. Inspector Graves grows restless. Cliff's Graves was no fool, but he was impatient. By the 5th day, his temper began to fray. "We've motive enough for half the household," he told Miss Marple gruffly, "but no proof. The Redmayne woman lies, Blake's drowning in debt. That companion, Harriet, could have snapped under cruelty, and the vicar lord knows what to make of him. I'll be forced to act soon." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with her mild smile. "Sometimes, Inspector, the truth is like a pattern on lace. Pull too hastily, and you ruin it. Better to wait until the last thread falls into place." Graves Herod, unconvinced, a visit to the village the following morning. Miss Marple asked the inspector's permission to walk into St. Mary Mead for a little air. He reluctantly agreed, and she set out with her basket. Her first stop was the chemist's shop. After a polite inquiry, she learned that Harriet Fielding had indeed purchased cough syrup the week before, but nothing stronger. Edmund Blake, however, had made repeated inquiries about rat poison, though he had not purchased any. Next, she called on Mrs. Price Ridley, the village's most incorrigible gossip. Over tea, she gently probed. Lady Caroline was a remarkable woman, Miss Marple remarked. "Remarkable? Yes," sniffed Mrs. Price Ridley, "but not universally beloved, if you take my meaning. Poor Harriet, treated like a slave. And young Edmund, well, she held the purse strings too tightly, that's for certain. And as for Mrs. Redmayne," she leaned forward. "There were whispers, you know, about her friendship with a certain gentleman in Bath. Caroline found out, so they say. Threatened exposure." Miss Marple nodded politely, though her mind was alert. Blackmail law, its threat was often the seed of murder. The key detail on her return to the manor. Miss Marple sat again in the drawing-room, studying the painted teacups still displayed upon the lace cloth. She leaned closer, and then, very softly, she murmured to herself, "Ah, of course. 4 on 1 cup." The cup that had shattered from Lady Caroline's hand, she saw, just beneath the painted roses, the faintest smear of residue. Not tea, nor milk, but a tiny discoloration around the rim, a drop placed deliberately, after the cup had been filled. It was not the cup that had been poisoned, nor the pot. It was the act of serving. Someone had slipped the poison into Lady Caroline's cup in the moment after it was poured, ensuring it was hers alone. Miss Marple sat back, her eyes twinkling. The painted teacups had been nothing more than a distraction, a theatrical flourish. The true clue was in the ritual of serving. Drawing out the truth that evening, Miss Marple engaged Reverend Miles in conversation by the fire. "You spoke so eloquently of the serpent," she said gently. "One cannot help but think you know more of poison than most." The Reverend flushed, purely scholarly interest. "Miss Marple, I assure you." "Oh, of course," she said kindly. "And yet, it is curious how knowledge tempts one, is it not? To know that a few grains could silence a tyrant forever. Temptation is strongest where opportunity meets resentment." The Reverend stammered something about scripture, but his eyes were uneasy. Miss Marple noted it, but she also knew he was not the one. His vanity might lead him to overspeak, but he lacked the icy composure of a true poisoner. The companions slipped later that night. Miss Marple found Harriet in the still-room again, polishing nervously. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "do you recall which cup your mistress drank from?" Harriet blinked. "Of course, the one with roses." "Ah, but are you quite sure? I thought you were occupied with the sugar bowl at the time." Harriet's face crumpled. "I only meant well. I must have seen." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on hers. "You wish to shield someone. Perhaps shielding is admirable in its loyalty, but dangerous when it obstructs justice." Harriet burst into tears, protesting she knew nothing. Miss Marple soothed her, but quietly stored away the contradiction. Harriet's memory was either faulty or influenced. A private experiment the following morning. Miss Marple asked permission to conduct a small experiment in the drawing-room. The household, curious, assembled. "I should like," she said mildly, "for each of us to take tea again, just as before. Let us recreate the scene." Inspector Graves frowned, but allowed it. The cups were arranged, the pot filled, and Lady Caroline's ritual repeated. Each person took a cup. Miss Marple watched carefully. She saw how Mrs. Redmayne, graceful as ever, leaned across at precisely the same moment to adjust the sandwiches. She saw Edmund's restless hands hover near the decanter. She saw Harriet, trembling, hold out the sugar bowl, and she saw most clearly that Mrs. Redmayne's fingers brushed, just for an instant, the rim of the Colonel's cup before passing it to him, a movement so slight it could easily be missed. Miss Marple's needles clicked rapidly in her lap. Yes, there it was, the pattern complete, the quiet confrontation that evening. Miss Marple requested a private word with Inspector Graves. "Inspector," she said gently, "I believe I can tell you not only who murdered Lady Caroline, but how. Yet you must allow me a little theatre, for the truth is best revealed in company." Graves looked skeptical. "You mean to unmask the killer yourself?" Miss Marple smiled. "I mean only to arrange the facts so that the truth may declare itself. People, Inspector, have a way of betraying themselves when the curtain is drawn back, and so it was decided. The following evening, all guests would gather once more in the drawing-room, the painted teacups arrayed before them. Miss Marple, quiet and unassuming, would take the stage not as an actress, but as a knitter who had at last finished her pattern. She knew now whose hand had painted death upon porcelain. She knew whose motive had been strong enough, whose nerves steady enough, whose deception clever enough. And soon, in front of all, she would lay bare the truth. The gathering evening fell heavy upon Hartwell Manor. In the drawing-room, the lamps glowed softly, throwing shadows against the damask curtains. A fire hissed and popped, though the air was taut with expectation. Inspector Graves stood near the hearth, arms folded. Edmund Blake lounged in a chair, his leg jiggling nervously. Reverend Miles hovered by the bookshelves, fingers twitching at his collar. Harriet Fielding sat pale and silent, hands clasped tight in her lap. And Mrs. Redmayne, elegant as ever, occupied the sofa with the poise of a woman certain she would not be touched by scandal. Miss Marple, knitting bag at her side, took her place at the small table where the painted teacups gleamed once more. "My friends," she began gently, "forgive the intrusion of an old woman, but I have lived long, and I have learned that truth, like a weed in the garden, always pushes through the soil, no matter how carefully one attempts to conceal it. Lady Caroline's death was not chance, nor heart failure. It was murder, and the key lies here." She touched the rim of the rose-painted cup. "The explanation unfolds. Lady Caroline was poisoned, not in the teapot, nor in the sugar bowl, but directly in her cup after it was poured. A swift, discreet gesture. That was why she alone was stricken. The painted teacups were no accident, but a deliberate means of ensuring hers would be unmistakable." Gasps rippled through the room. Inspector Graves leaned forward. "Go on, Miss Marple. Let us consider our company," she said. Edmund, whose debts grew so pressing, he might have wished his aunt gone, yet he lacks the steadiness for so delicate an act. He blusters, but a poisoner requires patience, precision and cold blood. "No, Edmund." Edmund flushed scarlet. "I wouldn't have dared," he muttered, almost in relief. "Harriet," Miss Marple continued, "suffered cruelly under Lady Caroline. A motive, yes, but resentment does not easily translate to murder. Her tears are genuine, her memory confused, but she is no poisoner." Harriet gave a sob, nodding fervently. "The Reverend Miles yes. He knows his toxins." His words painted temptation vividly, but his vanity betrays him. A true poisoner would not speak so openly, nor so rashly. His knowledge was theory, not practice. The Reverend sputtered, then fell silent, crimson with mingled shame and relief. And so, Miss Marple's voice softened. "We come to Mrs. Redmayne, poised, graceful, with hands that move lightly across a cup's rim. Hands that, during our little experiment yesterday, brushed against the Colonel's cup just as they once brushed against Lady Caroline's." All eyes turned sharply. Mrs. Redmayne's smile faltered for the first time. The motive revealed. "You see," Miss Marple went on, "Lady Caroline discovered your indiscretion. Mrs. Redmayne, a certain gentleman in Bath, and letters that would have ruined your reputation. Lady Caroline, who delighted in control, threatened exposure. For you, it meant ruin, social, financial, personal. The only way to silence her was permanent." Mrs. Redmayne straightened, her eyes flashing. "That is outrageous. Mere gossip." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice. "Gossip can be cruel, but in this case, it was truth. Lady Caroline confided in her solicitor, intending to amend her will. I confirmed it this morning. You stood to lose everything: your annuity, your position here, your respectability. That, I fear, is motive enough." Inspector Graves produced a packet of papers, and indeed, Mrs. Redmayne, These letters from Bath were found in your writing desk this afternoon. The room froze. The breaking point. Redmayne's composure cracked. Her hands clenched the arms of the sofa. She would have destroyed me, she whispered fiercely. After all, I had endured her tyranny, her scorn. Do you know what it is, Miss Marple, to live always under another's shadow? To have your very life dictated? She held my past over me like a lash. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Yes, my dear, but murder is not freedom. It is another kind of prison. Mrs. Redmayne's head bowed. For a moment, silence reigned but for the fire's hiss. Then she spoke, low and bitter. I slipped it in as I passed her cup. Just a drop, colorless, tasteless. She never noticed. No one did. Her shoulders sagged, until you, Inspector Graves, stepped forward. Mrs. Redmayne, I must place you under arrest for the murder of Lady Caroline Hartwell. Harriet gasped. Edmund swore. The Reverend crossed himself shakily. Mrs. Redmayne rose, her elegance gone, and allowed herself to be led away. Aftermath. In the days that followed, Hartwell Manor settled into uneasy quiet. The painted teacups were packed away, their roses dulled by scandal. Edmund, chastened, spoke of seeking honest work in London. Harriet was offered a post by a kindly neighbour, her burdens eased. Reverend Miles retreated into scripture, his vanity somewhat tempered. Inspector Graves, though gruff, sought Miss Marple out before leaving. I owe you thanks, Miss Marple. You see things we policemen miss. Wouldn't have spotted that trick with the cup myself. Miss Marple smiled serenely. One sees a great deal when one spends a lifetime pouring tea. Inspector, people think it trivial, but in the rituals of daily life, the truth often hides. Epilogue. Back in her cottage at St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her hearth, her needles clicking softly. Outside, the church bell tolled, and the air was fragrant with autumn roses. She reflected, not without sadness, that Lady Caroline's iron hand had sown the seeds of her own destruction. Power wielded without kindness breeds enemies. And yet, how tragic that it should end in poison slipped into porcelain. She set down her knitting, reached for her own teacup, and smiled faintly. For all the world's troubles, she murmured, there is still comfort in a good cup of tea provided. One chooses one's company wisely. And with that, she sipped, the village around her already drifting back into its gentle rhythm. The dark chapter of Hartwell Manor closed.